There is a continent at the bottom of the world that was the last great landmass to be fully revealed to European geography, a place so old, so vast, so biologically extraordinary, and so completely unlike anywhere else on Earth that the people who first saw it from European ships struggled to find words adequate to describe what they were looking at. It had been inhabited for 65,000 years. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who had lived on the Australian continent since the last ice age had developed one of the oldest and most sophisticated relationships between human beings and landscape in the entire history of the human species. A culture of extraordinary complexity and richness. A knowledge of the Australian environment so deep and so precise that it constituted one of the great bodies of ecological understanding ever accumulated by any human community. Expressed through the specific interwoven system of law and ceremony and story and land management that outsiders would spend centuries failing to fully understand. The continent they inhabited was biological wonder. Marsupials, the pouched mammals that had evolved in isolation on the Australian landmass for millions of years and that existed nowhere else on Earth in their diversity and abundance. Monotremes, the egg-laying mammals, the platypus, and the echidna, creatures so improbable that the first European scientists who examined specimens sent back from Australia assumed they were hoaxes. Eucalyptus forests and spinifex grasslands and tropical rainforests and the red desert of the interior and the Great Barrier Reef along the northeastern coast. A biological inventory so different from anything in the European experience that every naturalist who encountered it spent years trying to reorganize their understanding of how life on Earth actually worked. And yet, from the European perspective of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, it was invisible. Not because it was small. Australia is the sixth largest country on Earth, larger than all of Europe, a continent whose eastern coast alone stretches for 4,000 kilometers. It was invisible because it was so far from everything European geography knew and cared about, because the wind and current systems of the southern Pacific made approaching it from the east difficult, and because the specific direction of European colonial expansion in the 15th and 16th centuries had focused on the Americas and the Indian Ocean trade routes rather than on whatever might lie in the vast southern Pacific. The story of Australia's discovery, from the European perspective, is not a single story with a single hero. It is a layered story of multiple encounters across more than 2 centuries, involving Portuguese and Dutch and British navigators, each adding a piece to the geographical picture that took until 1803 to be complete. And the person who finally completed the picture, who sailed around the entire continent and proved for the first time that it was a single landmass rather than a collection of large islands, was a British naval officer from Lincolnshire named Matthew Flinders, whose circumnavigation of Australia in 1801 to 1803 produced the maps that defined the continent for European geography, and whose suggestion of the name Australia was eventually adopted for the continent he had mapped. But before Flinders. Before Cook, whose 1770 mapping of the eastern coast is the most famous chapter in the European discovery of Australia. Before the Dutch navigators who made the first confirmed European sightings of the Australian coast in the early 17th century. Before all of it, there was the continent itself, and the 65,000 years of human habitation that preceded every European arrival. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia arrived on the continent approximately 65,000 years ago, making them the oldest continuous civilization on Earth, their cultural traditions and their connection to the Australian landscape stretching back to a time when modern Europe was covered in glacier and the ancestors of the people who would eventually build the Parthenon and the Colosseum were painting caves in France. They crossed from Southeast Asia during a period of lower sea levels that made the journey shorter than it is today, still a significant open water crossing that required navigational skill and the specific courage of people pushing into the unknown. Over 65,000 years they spread across the entire continent, from the tropical rainforests of Queensland to the desert interior to the temperate south to the island that is now Tasmania, adapting to every Australian environment with the specific thoroughness of a species that has time and intelligence on its side. They developed the specific land management techniques, most famously the practice of controlled burning, the deliberate use of fire to manage vegetation and promote the growth of food plants, that shaped the Australian landscape so comprehensively that the landscape European explorers encountered was not a wilderness but a managed environment. The product of millennia of deliberate human intervention, whose effects were invisible to eyes that could not read the signs. Their knowledge of the Australian environment was encyclopedic, every plant and every animal and every water source and every weather pattern in their territory known and named and incorporated into the specific web of story and ceremony and law that constituted the intellectual and spiritual life of each community. The songlines, the network of narrative paths that connected every significant feature of the landscape to a story that encoded geographical and ecological knowledge in a form transmissible across generations without writing, were one of the most sophisticated information management systems ever developed by any human culture. A living map of an entire continent stored in song and ceremony and the specific memory traditions of hundreds of distinct language groups. This was the world that European ships began to encounter in the early 17th century. From the outside, briefly, incomprehendingly, and without the specific intellectual framework to understand what they were seeing. The Portuguese were probably the first Europeans to sight the Australian coast. There is circumstantial evidence, including a map known as the Deep Maps produced in France in the 1540s that shows a large southern landmass in approximately the right position for Australia, suggesting that Portuguese navigators had encountered it before the map was made. The evidence is suggestive rather than conclusive. The historical debate about Portuguese priority has never been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. But the possibility that Portuguese ships sailing the eastern Indian Ocean trade routes in the early 16th century encountered the northwestern Australian coast is entirely plausible. The Dutch were the first to make confirmed, documented sightings of the Australian coast. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, the Verenigde Oost-Indisch Company, the most powerful commercial corporation in the 17th century world, controlled the Indian Ocean spice trade from its headquarters at Batavia in what is now Indonesia, and its ships sailed regularly between the Cape of Good Hope and Batavia on the trade winds of the southern Indian Ocean. In 1611, a Dutch captain named Hendrik Brouwer discovered that sailing far south on the way from the Cape to Batavia, using the powerful westerly winds of the Roaring Forties, was dramatically faster than the traditional route hugging the African and Indian coasts. The Brouwer route, as it became known, required ships to sail east on the Roaring Forties and then turn north toward Batavia at the right moment. But the right moment was difficult to judge without accurate longitudinal navigation, and ships that turned north too late found themselves running into the western coast of a large land mass that had no place in their charts. The western and northwestern coast of Australia appeared in the charts of the Dutch East India Company as a hazard, a coast to be avoided, a lee shore in the prevailing winds, a place where ships ran aground if they misjudged their longitude. The Dutch named it New Holland. They explored portions of it, the western coast, the northwestern coast, the southern coast, with the specific practical assessment of commercial navigators looking for useful harbours and tradable commodities and finding neither. Willem Janszoon was the first Dutch navigator to make a confirmed landing on the Australian mainland, in 1606, on the western shore of Cape York Peninsula in what is now Queensland, exploring a portion of the coast in the Gulf of Carpentaria while looking for gold and trade opportunities. He encountered Aboriginal people, and the encounter, like most early European Aboriginal encounters, ended in violence, with deaths on both sides. Janszoon reported no commercial opportunities and returned to Batavia. He had set foot on the Australian continent, though he believed he was on the coast of New Guinea rather than a separate landmass, and noted its existence without understanding its significance. Dirk Hartog landed on the western Australian coast in 1616, leaving a pewter plate inscribed with the details of his visit nailed to a post at the location now called Cape Inscription, the first European artifact left on Australian soil, discovered by a later Dutch captain and eventually making its way to a museum in Amsterdam where it still resides. Abel Tasman made the most significant Dutch contribution to Australian geography, sailing the entire southern extent of Australia without sighting it, because he was too far south, but discovering the island that now bears his name, Tasmania, in 1642, and demonstrating that whatever land lay to the north of his route was not connected to the hypothetical southern continent extending to the South Pole. The English arrived in the form of William Dampier, a pirate-turned-navigator-turned-author whose visit to the northwestern Australian coast in 1688 and again in 1699 produced the first English observations of Australian Aboriginal people and Australian wildlife, published in accounts that were read across Europe and that were, in their specific combination of genuine observation and cultural condescension, representative of everything that subsequent European engagement with Australia would be. Dampier described the Aboriginal people he encountered as the miserablest people in the world, a judgment reflecting the specific failure of a 17th-century English buccaneer to understand anything about the people he was looking at, whose apparent lack of the material possessions that European culture valued masked the extraordinary richness of the knowledge system and the social organization that Dampier had neither the time nor the intellectual framework to observe. He did note, with the genuine curiosity of a naturalist, the specific biological strangeness of the Australian environment. Animals unlike anything in European experience, plants of unfamiliar form, a landscape that seemed to operate by rules different from anything he had encountered elsewhere. James Cook's arrival on the eastern Australian coast in April 1770 is the most famous chapter in the European discovery of Australia, and the most consequential, because it was Cook's voyage that produced the geographical claim that led directly to British colonisation, and British colonisation that produced the specific catastrophic consequences for Aboriginal Australians that Cook himself did not intend and could not have fully foreseen. Cook was on his first Great Pacific voyage, sent to Tahiti to observe the transit of Venus across the Sun, carrying sealed orders to proceed afterward in search of the hypothetical southern continent that geographical theory still required to balance the northern landmasses. His ship the Endeavour carried, in addition to the naval crew, a team of scientists and naturalists including Joseph Banks, a young botanist of considerable wealth and considerable scientific ambition who would become, through the specimens and observations he collected on the voyage, one of the most influential scientific figures of the late 18th century. Cook sailed west from New Zealand and encountered the southeastern corner of the Australian continent at a point he named Point Hicks, after the officer who first sighted land, on April 19, 1770. He turned north and spent the following months sailing up the eastern coast, making observations and landings and accumulating the geographical knowledge that his charts would eventually convey to the world. The most significant landing was at a bay on the southeastern coast where Banks and his scientific team found such an extraordinary abundance of previously unknown plant species that Cook eventually named it Botany Bay, the bay that would become famous 16 years later as the location considered for the first British settlement in Australia, and whose name would become synonymous in the British consciousness with the penal colony that was eventually established at Port Jackson to the north. The encounter with Aboriginal Australians at Botany Bay was brief and inadequate. Cook attempted communication, found it impossible across the language barrier, made some observations of the people he encountered that were more respectful than Dampier's but still fundamentally limited by the specific European inability to comprehend a culture organised on principles entirely different from anything in the European experience, and moved on. He landed at several other points along the coast, attempted communication where possible, and continued north. The near disaster on the Great Barrier Reef, when the Endeavour struck a coral reef in June 1770 and was only saved by the specific combination of good seamanship and the technique of fothering, drawing a sail under the hull to plug the leak, demonstrated both the hazard of the Australian coast and the quality of Cook's seamanship in managing the crisis. The ship was beached for 7 weeks on the river that now bears the ship's name, the Endeavour River near what is now Cooktown, for repairs, and the time ashore gave Banks and the naturalists their most extended opportunity for Australian observation, producing a collection of specimens that astonished European science when the expedition eventually returned home. Cook reached the northern tip of the continent and formally claimed the eastern coast for Britain on August 22, 1770, at a small island he called Possession Island, reading the proclamation and raising the British flag in the specific ceremony that the European tradition of territorial acquisition required, and that the Aboriginal people who had inhabited the continent for 65,000 years had not been consulted about and would not have recognised as having any validity. The British colonisation that followed Cook's voyage, beginning with the First Fleet's arrival at Port Jackson in January 1788, was one of the most consequential and most catastrophic encounters between European expansion and indigenous civilization in the entire history of colonialism. The Aboriginal population of Australia at the time of European contact has been estimated at between 300,000 and 1 million people, organised into hundreds of distinct language groups with sophisticated social and territorial arrangements that the British colonists neither understood nor respected. The consequences were devastating and rapid. Smallpox, introduced within months of the First Fleet's arrival, possibly from the colonists' own supplies, swept through the Aboriginal communities of the Sydney region with the specific demographic catastrophe of a disease encountering a population with no immunity. Violence, the specific systematic violence of colonial expansion claiming land that was legally and morally occupied, followed. The specific combination of disease and dispossession and the destruction of the ecological and social systems on which Aboriginal life depended produced one of the most rapid and most complete demographic collapses in the history of any Indigenous population. Matthew Flinders arrived in Australia in 1795 as a young naval officer, made several coastal voyages that gave him detailed knowledge of specific sections of the Australian coast, and returned in 1801 with a specific commission to circumnavigate the continent and determine once and for all whether it was a single landmass or a collection of large islands connected by shallow straits. His ship was the Investigator, a small sloop of war that proved barely adequate for the demands of the voyage, and his scientific complement included the botanist Robert Brown, whose collections from the voyage would eventually produce one of the foundational texts of Australian botany, and the artist Ferdinand Bauer, whose extraordinarily precise botanical and zoological illustrations documented the Australian natural world with a beauty and an accuracy that have never been surpassed. Flinders circumnavigated Australia in 1801 to 1803, sailing west along the southern coast, north along the western coast, east along the northern coast, and south along the eastern coast, filling in the sections that previous navigators had mapped and connecting them into a single coherent picture of the continent's outline. He proved that Australia was a single landmass. He named features of the coast with the specific systematic thoroughness of a naval surveyor: Spencer Gulf, Gulf St. Vincent, Kangaroo Island, the Investigator Strait. He encountered a French expedition under Nicolas Baudin at Encounter Bay on the southern coast, a meeting whose significance lay in the French presence in Australian waters and the possibility that France might establish a claim to portions of the continent before Britain could consolidate its own. He proposed the name Australia, from Terra Australis, the Latin term for the hypothetical southern continent, as a simpler and more euphonious alternative to New Holland, the Dutch name that had been in use since the early 17th century. The name was eventually adopted by the British government in 1817, and the continent that had been inhabited for 65,000 years and known to European geography for 2 centuries finally had the name that the world would use. Flinders did not live to see his maps published in their final form. Returning to England, his ship so deteriorated that he had to transfer to another vessel at Mauritius. He was detained by the French governor of the island for 6.5 years. The Napoleonic Wars having made him technically an enemy subject, his scientific mission notwithstanding. He was released in 1810, returned to England, and spent his final years preparing his charts and his account of the voyage for publication. Voyage to Terra Australis was published on July 18, 1814. Matthew Flinders died the following day, aged 40 years. He never knew that his work had been published. He never knew that the name he had proposed for the continent would be adopted. His charts defined Australia for European geography for decades. His circumnavigation proved the continent's unity. His name was given to rivers and reefs and mountains and eventually to a university, and to the cat that accompanied him on the Investigator, a tabby named Trim who survived the circumnavigation and whose statue now sits beside Flinders' own outside the State Library of New South Wales in Sydney. The continent that Flinders mapped is still there. Still the 6th largest country on Earth. Still the home of the most biologically extraordinary collection of species on the planet. The marsupials and the monotremes and the eucalypts and the reef and the desert and the rainforest. Still the home of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, whose 65,000 years of continuous civilization is the longest in human history, and whose relationship to the Australian landscape is the deepest and most sophisticated that any human community has ever developed. Still Chomolungma. Still Sagarmatha. Still Australia. The oldest continent. The last to be revealed to the world that did not already know it. And still, in ways that the world is only beginning to fully understand, the most extraordinary place on Earth.